Ellie Henshaw woke up to a biting cold. Her body trembled from the dampness, and her head throbbed as if it had been struck by a hammer. Opening her eyes, she realized she was lying in the middle of a yacht's cabin. Moonlight filtered through a broken window, casting strange shadows on the walls. Her mouth was dry, and the air smelled sharply of iron. Looking down, Ellie froze. Her hands, her dress, the floor beneath her, all were soaked in blood. Horror gripped her, and she recoiled, but only then did she notice something else. A knife was clenched in her fingers. The blade gleamed with crimson liquid. She screamed and dropped it. The sound of the knife clattering against the metal floor seemed deafening. "Rob!" she gasped hoarsely, but the silence that engulfed her answered only with an eerie quiet. Her heart raced. Ellie bolted out onto the deck, clutching the walls to steady herself. The wind ripped through her hair, and waves crashed loudly against the yacht's hull. "Rob!" Her voice tore through the night. Her bare feet stopped near the railing. Red streaks were visible on the metal surface, leading to the edge. Her eyes locked onto the railing. Blood smeared as though hands had clutched it before disappearing overboard. "No, no, no," she whispered, gasping for air. Her body trembled, her mind refusing to accept the truth. She rushed back into the cabin, desperately searching for her phone, but it was gone. Everything seemed as if someone had deliberately left her alone, cut off from communication with no means of escape. She scanned the cabin again and noticed another detail she hadn't seen before. A bottle of champagne on the table. The cork was popped, the liquid half spilled. Nearby, 2 glasses, one overturned. Its walls bore reddish streaks, resembling traces of poison. What happened? Her voice broke. Ellie remembered the last thing. A romantic evening with Rob, his smile, how he had raised a glass to a new chapter in their lives. Then a sharp dizziness and silence. When the yacht was found at dawn, the police immediately launched an investigation. But by the first day, everything turned against Ellie. All the evidence, her fingerprints on the knife, signs of a struggle in the cabin, even Rob's phone records hinting at his affair, pointed to her. Ellie couldn't believe her eyes when they showed her a note found in her purse. "I can't forgive you, Rob. You betrayed me. Now you will pay." "It wasn't me. Someone set me up," she screamed, but her voice drowned in the cold, accusing stares of the investigators. The trial was swift. The prosecutor painted a picture of an enraged wife unable to cope with betrayal. Witnesses confirmed Rob was successful but far from perfect, implying affairs on the side. Ellie lost control of her life. 15 years in prison, the judge declared. Her scream filled the courtroom. In the small cell, she was tormented by nightmares. Every night, she saw Rob, his face bloodied, eyes wide open, staring at her. One night, she woke to find words written in blood on the floor by her bed. "You know who I am." Weeks later, she received a letter in prison. It contained only one sentence: "Rob is alive. Seek the truth before it's too late." Who sent this? How was it possible? And why did she feel more and more that her life was part of some horrific plan? In the cold walls of the prison, Ellie quickly realized that this place didn't forgive weakness. Every day, she fought for survival, facing humiliations, threats, and physical violence. Her body was covered in bruises, and her mind slowly began to adjust to the fact that every step she took came with a fight. But even here, she remained unwavering, knowing she had been set up and would find a way to escape. Her ally became Jen Rose, a woman with a dark past who had earned the respect of other inmates with her cold intellect and ruthlessness. At first, Jen was indifferent toward Ellie, but when Ellie defended her during a conflict in the cafeteria, their alliance became clear. "You're not like the others," Jen said, sitting beside her one night in the cell. "You fight, but not because you're used to it. You fight because you have something to fight for." "What are you really doing here, Henshaw?" Ellie hesitated, but eventually, she told her everything. The night on the yacht, Rob's disappearance, the setup that made her look like a murderer. Jen was silent for a long time, staring at the wall. Then she quietly spoke. My brother, William, used to work for your husband. He said Rob was into something dirty, money transfers, setups, threats. One day, William vanished without a trace. Everything pointed to Rob shutting him up for good. Maybe he was planning the same for you. Ellie listened in silence, feeling her world crumble once more. Her mind was racing with images. Rob, the romantic evening, the blood, the knives. But if he was alive, why was she here? Over the next few months, Jen gathered information through her connections. One day, she brought Ellie a yellowed envelope, retrieved at great personal risk. Inside were photocopies of documents from an offshore bank. One name stood out like a knife to the heart: Robert Marshall. These are offshore accounts. He's hiding money, Jen explained. And if his accounts are still active, then he's not dead. Ellie's heart tightened. She made a decision. She would escape and find the truth. The escape was dangerous and bloody. The plan was simple but risky. Jen set a fire in the block by igniting mattresses. The alarm blared, and the staff scrambled to evacuate others. Amid the chaos, Jen and Ellie managed to find a way out through a ventilation shaft using makeshift tools. But chaos came at a cost. When they reached the corridor, a guard spotted them and rushed to stop them. Without hesitation, Jen attacked him with a sharp piece of metal she had ripped from the bed. Blood poured onto the floor, and his screams froze Ellie in place. "Don't look," Jen hissed, grabbing her hand. "If you want to live, run." They made it through the back gate, scaling the fence under fire from the guards. One bullet grazed Jen's shoulder, but she only grinned, spitting out blood. By dawn, they were standing in an abandoned forest outside the prison. Ellie was in shock, her body trembling, but Jen wrapped her arm around her shoulders. "We're free now, but this is just the beginning, Ellie. If Rob's alive, we'll find him, and he will pay." For the first time in a long while, Ellie allowed herself to cry. But these weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of anger. Ellie was now living under a fake identity, going by the name Rachel Grace. Her long, dark hair was now cut short and lightened to a silvery blonde. Large glasses covered her face, and her walk had changed, so even those who might recognize her wouldn't suspect a thing. New York greeted her with noise, chaos, and a sea of opportunities, but amidst the crowd, she felt small and vulnerable. The search for Rob continued for weeks. Jen stayed in a safe place, supporting Ellie remotely. She managed to get the address of a woman named Caitlin Sanders, who seemed to have ties to Rob through his financial dealings. Ellie watched Caitlin every day from a distance as she lived in a luxurious Manhattan penthouse. Tall, elegant, and cold, Caitlin appeared to have everything under control. Ellie meticulously planned how to break into the apartment. She chose the night Caitlin had a meeting at one of the city's most expensive restaurants. Her heart was pounding like a drum as she broke the lock, putting on gloves. Inside, everything was sterile, as though no one had ever lived there. On the table lay a laptop. Ellie opened it, but the login was password protected. She stumbled upon a small notebook hidden among some books. The notes contained wire transfer schematics, names, and dates. All of them pointed to an organization known as Alpha Omega. But the creepiest part was that among the names were several businessmen presumed dead, including Robert Marshall. Suddenly, the silence of the apartment was broken. The door clicked shut softly. Ellie froze. Light footsteps were approaching. She quickly hid the notebook and looked around for an escape. But the hallway was blocked by a man in a black mask. His movements were precise, predator-like, and his eyes burned with cold determination. "You think you can dig this deep and walk away alive?" he rasped, pulling out a knife. Ellie instantly dashed toward the kitchen. He chased her, knocking over furniture. The apartment, which had seemed so spacious, now felt like a trap. Ellie grabbed a heavy frying pan, and when the man got closer, she swung it with all her might, hitting him in the head. He staggered but didn't fall. He only grew angrier. He struck Ellie in the chest, knocking her to the ground. The knife swiped just above her face, slicing through a strand of her hair. Panicking, Ellie shoved a shelf, and it crashed down onto the attacker. She ran for the balcony, where rain was pouring down. The wind howled in her ears, and the height beneath her made her heart stop. "You won't get far," the man yelled, emerging from under the shelf. Ellie had no choice. She jumped onto the fire escape, barely holding on. Only sheer luck kept her from falling. As she descended, she could hear the man chasing her again. By the time Ellie reached the dark alley, she ran without looking back. Her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear her own breath. The man was somewhere behind her, but his threat hung over her like a shadow. She knew one thing: Alpha Omega was something bigger than she could have imagined. And if Rob was still part of it, she'd have to be even smarter to uncover the truth. But at that moment, she realized that her hunt wasn't just about the truth anymore. It had become a game of survival where losing meant death. After that terrifying night with the attacker in Caitlin's apartment, Ellie realized that her enemy was not just Rob, but a whole shadow organization operating with chilling precision. She had to lay low, but she wasn't going to stop. A few days later, Jen passed along shocking news. Rob, now living under the name Edward Lancaster, had spoken at one of the exclusive financial meetings for elite investors. Ellie was ready to take the risk. She secured a fake invitation and dressed in a sharp black suit, making herself look as professional as possible. Ellie slipped into the luxurious conference hall where the closed event for investors was being held. Her heart raced as she scanned the room full of people. And there he was, Rob, now Edward Lancaster. He was sitting at the center of attention, confidently leading the discussion. His manners were flawless, his face calm, as though nothing from the past had ever existed. Ellie stayed in the shadows, never taking her eyes off him. Would he recognize her? Would his gaze meet hers and betray the secret they both knew? Her thoughts were interrupted when their eyes met. He glanced at her, quick, but just long enough to send a shiver down her spine. And then nothing. He simply carried on. Ellie left early to follow him. She watched as he got into an expensive car and drove off. She trailed him down a road leading to the outskirts of the city, where a large estate stood, surrounded by dense trees. Ellie hid in the bushes, waiting for him to enter the house. After a while, she made her way inside. The estate was dark and eerie, despite its lavish appearance. Ellie stood in the dark hallway of the estate, holding a flashlight that trembled in her hand. The first floor appeared normal, luxurious living room, expensive furniture, paintings on the walls. But the basement, accessed by a narrow staircase, looked different. As she descended, the air seemed thicker, as if the very place was absorbing all her fears. The basement walls were lined with shelves, filled with boxes. Some contained old photographs of hers, newspaper clippings, letters she had written to friends that she thought had never reached their destination. In the middle of the room stood a table with an album on it. She opened it, and her heart stopped. There were photos of her life with Rob or Edward. Ordinary wedding shots, vacation pictures at first glance, but then there were photos of her taken secretly. In the park, at home, even in prison. On the back of each photo were notes that sent a cold chill through her. She's not the same anymore. Her gaze has changed. 10 years, and she still doesn't understand. How long will she last this time? Ellie quickly realized that Rob hadn't just disappeared. He had planned to get rid of her long ago. All these years, he had been watching her, manipulating her life, pushing her toward decisions that only brought her closer to catastrophe. It turned out that her death had been part of the plan, and his disappearance had been a temporary measure to hide from her, waiting for the right moment to return and make his final move. Ellie couldn't wait any longer. The decision was made, and she acted without hesitation. After kidnapping Caitlin, she strapped the woman to a chair in a small room, trying to keep her unharmed, but using her as bait. She knew Rob wouldn't be able to resist. He'd come if he thought he could see her, and he came. Standing in the doorway, Rob looked at her with cold amusement. "Do you really think you can beat me?" His voice was sinister, void of any trace of former emotions. "I've been watching you all this time, all these years, and your suffering has fascinated me. I killed anyone who stood in my way, and you were just another link in this game." Ellie felt cold sweat slick her skin, but she didn't back down. She knew she had to maintain her cold resolve. "You have no idea what pain I've been through," she said, looking him in the eyes, cutting off his mockery. "You didn't just kill me, Rob. You broke every part of me, but you won't get that satisfaction." Rob smiled as he stepped closer. That's when Ellie noticed the cameras scattered around the house. He had been filming her the whole time. Her heart raced, but she didn't panic. "You recorded everything?" she asked with a cold smile. "All right, Rob. Now you'll confess to it all." Rob didn't respond, but she saw his face start to change. He realized that this time, the situation wasn't in his favor. He began speaking, confessing his crimes, the murders, the manipulations, and the lies. But Ellie knew this was it. This had to end now. "You're not my beast, Rob," she said and pressed a button on her bracelet. Rob, not expecting such a turn of events, froze for a moment, staring at Ellie, who seemed still under his control. But his surprise quickly turned to fury when he realized what had just happened. Ellie had pressed the detonator button, and in that instant, a powerful explosion rocked the ground. The blast wave hit the house, instantly destroying walls and ceilings. All the cameras that had been watching her every move for years exploded along with the broken metal frames and debris. Rob, who had been trying to escape, lost his balance and fell. His attempts to move, flee, or protect himself were futile. He stood for just a few seconds before a massive chunk of concrete, thrown by the shockwave, struck him. Robert's body was thrown in a series of impacts, torn apart by metal fragments and debris until it vanished into the darkness of the explosion. But that wasn't the end. Debris flew from every direction, from every corner. Smoke and fire consumed the space. Ellie, standing at the heart of the destruction, watched as Rob turned into a formless mass of blood and body parts mixed with building fragments. Only now, as the shockwave settled, could she see how the fire burned away the remains of his existence. No trace, no memory, only ash and burning wreckage. In the room where documents, cameras, and recordings had once been, there was nothing left, only charred walls and heaps of metal. Rob was no longer her pursuer, no longer the man she once loved. All that remained of him were the remnants of the past, with no way back. But Ellie didn't feel relief. The explosion had been her final move in this game. She was no longer just the victim. She was the one who finished it. The blast wave hit her from all sides, and she felt her body literally tear apart from the pain. There was no more despair, just emptiness and darkness. She lost consciousness, and as the world died around her, Ellie died instantly. The explosion destroyed everything: her fight, her memories, her desire for revenge. Nothing remained, only the wreckage and the silent stillness, which became her final testimony in this nightmarish conclusion. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment about what you think of this shocking ending. And remember, in this world, no one disappears without a trace.